I'm Rachel, and this is my Friday Reads video for June 21st, 2019. I started out by reading this graphic novel, Persepolis, The Story of a Childhood by Marjane Satrapi. I got this at a banned book scavenger hunt that the DC Library puts out every year, and it compelled me to read a couple of graphic novels, and it's an interesting little art form here. This one in particular is a little longer, so I feel like she was able to pack in more of a story. This is the story of Satrapi growing up around the time of the Islamic Revolution. There's a lot of history in here about Iran, from well before even the 20th century, about sort of their national and cultural even myths about who they were as a people. And then we get into the, immediate history of the reign of the Shah, who was seen as very corrupt and certainly, put in power by Western forces who didn't necessarily have Iran's best interests in heart. And her parents were Marxists who wanted a cultural revolution for the working class and intellectuals, and that's not really how it went down with the religious revolution of 1979. It was more anti-intellectual, anti-Western influence, that sort of thing, and suddenly just as many, if not more, people were being oppressed by the new government. And then also we get into the war with Iraq, and this is all the stuff that's happening as Satrapi is growing up, and her parents are political, so she's very aware of a lot of things, and even attending protests, and has contact with people who had been in jail and who would be executed even. But I also like that she got to be a little girl in this, because I felt like that made sense, given her background, her middle-class sort of Western background, that a lot of it was about protests or about slowly having to hide any of your Western lifestyle from your neighbors, because, people would be snitching on each other. But it was also about her being a young girl growing up in the 80s, and going to parties and that sort of thing. Anyway, I'm not much of an artist, but I like this style, this thickly drawn black and white stark style, which I thought kind of went well for the fact that she was a young girl and this is the reality that she's growing up in. So there was something kind of juvenile and playful about it even, but also it belied how small she was in the world. There's a lot of panels kind of like this one where it's a wide shot and there's like a small figure or the car, that sort of thing. I like that. So ultimately I found this to be informative and moving, and I'm glad I got to it. Next, I just finished the Ensemble by Aja Gabel. This is the final book that I cherry-picked for myself to read off of the BookTube Prize Octafinals list. Although this book didn't actually make it out of the Octafinals, even though we're now in the semifinals. This is a book about four people who play in a chamber music quartet with one another, a strings chamber music quartet. And there's a lot of music in this. Gabel starts out every section of the book with the pieces being discussed in it. And of course someone on YouTube, maybe a booktuber, put together a playlist of all of the music mentioned in here, so that's really cool. We start when they're very young and they're about to graduate conservatory in 1992, and they have a sort of rocky start to the group when they're all deciding to put their lot in together to make a group rather than doing anything solo or something like that. And it's sort of made more tense by the fact that one of the members, Henry, is a prodigy, and he's sort of head and shoulders above the rest in terms of talent. And then Jana is like the really driven one, and then the other two, are good musicians, but as well. But there's just tension there, also interpersonal tension. They're very young and desperate for, their success, and sort of sexually charged, I suppose. Nothing too out there, but anyway. The book follows them for the next 15 years, or almost 20 years actually, throughout their careers, and it goes a lot into not only the music they play, but the relationships they have, and how they see themselves as people, especially as their careers change, but also their personal aspirations change as they grow older. I thought it was a good book. I liked it, although I could see its weaknesses as well. She has some of my own weakness, I think, of relying too much on narrative voice, so that sometimes the flow of the story could get really bogged down and distant. And I think that she should have had more active scenes sometimes, and sometimes it was less getting to know the characters than her telling us about the characters. But that was offset by the fact that she so beautifully described the music and how these people related to it, and then also sort of the argument, as it were, between going solo or creating music as a group and what it means to harmonize with one another, which of course can get into nice metaphors about relationships and life. I just really liked having a look at people who take on this sort of artistic lifestyle, and I like the characters. I just sort of wish that Gabel had relied on more active storytelling. I wish that she'd stuck to one POV per chapter, as it were. I think there were some confusing bits in the beginning, maybe even some timeline things that contrasted with one another, but nothing too jarring, nothing too big, and certainly by the end, you get to know and appreciate these people. So I think this is one of those books that, even though it didn't make it far, it still deserved the special recognition that it got. And I think it was just such a unique book too, because I don't think there's a lot of novels out there about the current day classical music community and people who choose this life. Also, one of the main characters, Jana, has my sister's name, and it's so unusual. I knew I would be drawn to this for biased reasons, but beyond that particular bias, there's also the bias that when I was growing up, I was part of children's choruses, and I remember one time before a performance, my mother even told me, you don't necessarily have a soloist voice, but you're great at a chorus. And so I think everybody kind of strives for that special recognition. Like that's what you're supposed to want, I suppose, in any sort of art, is to stand out on your own. But there's a magic to being part of a group and learning how to harmonize with one another and really listen to one another and hear one another and have that inform how you sing or how you play. So I really, I guess I felt some personal affection for this book, and but again, I also think it was rather unique. And finally, next on the docket, I have The Turner House by Angela Flournoy. I remember basically 3 years ago now, I went to a reading she did at the DC Public Library, and I thought that there was such a strong character voice to this novel that I wanted to get to it. And then a couple years ago, I was visiting my family in Kansas City, and we were at a used bookstore, and I saw this, and so I picked it up, and now it's finally time to get to it. It got to the top of my Goodreads TBR. Anyway, I'll read from the flap, because this was a kind of big literary fiction book, but 3 years ago by now, so... The Turners live on Yarrow Street for over 50 years. Their house sees 13 children get grown and gone, and some return. It sees the arrival of grandchildren, the fall of Detroit's East Side, and the loss of a father. Despite abandoned lots, an embattled city, and the inevitable shift outward to the suburbs, the house still stands. But now, as their powerful mother falls ill and loses her independence, the Turners must lose their family home. Beset by time and national crisis, the house is worth just 1/10 of its mortgage. The Turner children are called back to decide its fate and to reckon with how each of their pasts might haunt and shape their family's future. A major new contribution to the literature on American families, the Turner House brings us a colorful brood full of love, pride, and unlikely inheritances. It's a striking examination of the American dream and a celebration of the ways in which our families bring us home. So yeah, this has me written all over it. Family drama! Sweeping epic scope! Or, at least within one generation it seems pretty, or 2 generations it seems pretty epic. So I'm really looking forward to getting to this. that about covers it for me now, and for the first time in 4 weeks, I am not going to Baltimore for the weekend. I'm pretty much staying here, but I have a lot of stuff going on. There's stuff happening at my synagogue for the Shabbat that I want to be involved in. And then I believe on Sunday my father and my niece will be coming to the DC area because our dinosaur wing in the Natural History Museum downtown just reopened after a huge renovation, and my niece Grace loves dinosaurs, so she'd been wanting to go for a while anyway. So I'm really excited, but that leaves less time again for doing other things, including reading. In the last couple of weeks I deliberately chose short books, but this time I really wanted to get to the Turner House, but it's, standard-sized book, or at least the average size for most contemporary literary fiction, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to finish it all over the weekend or if it'll spill into the week next week. Of course, I also still have more reading I want to do and more videos I want to do, and etc., etc. So we'll see how this goes, I guess. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.